Well, thank you, Philippe and Varen Vehicles, for having me here today. And thank you for everyone watching. I'm glad we could get together and talk about advanced aerial mobility and what that means for us, not only as companies and individuals and states, but as a human race. What does this really mean? And how does it come to be? We've been talking about flying cars for the last four decades, the last 40 years. People have made movies that movies about the future where the time has already come and gone to have flying cars. So where are they? Why aren't they happening? And why now? Why is this just at our doorstep? So I want to talk a little bit about what to expect, why to expect it, and how we make it become a reality. So urban air mobility is a new transportation system, and that requires a new airspace ecosystem. I love the vernacular that Varen Vehicles has adopted of geodesics, and I'm going to kind of talk about that a little bit and how we create those and what those mean to us. But I want to first start with aviation in general, and most of us know this. Today, we're going through kind of this inventive, creative space for advanced aerial mobility. Well, the Wright brothers went through that exact same environment, right? There were good ideas, there were bad ideas, and really, it came out to be one idea that won out the day, and that was the Wright brothers. Now, since then, since the first flight in a very balsa wood airplane, it was 66 years from first flight to first step. 66 years before man was on the moon, the first step on the moon. Neil Armstrong, that was a 66-year period. That's one lifetime. So here we are again on the precipice of a new kind of verge of aviation. The technology has taken us to this point. And while technology can take us to vertical takeoff and landing vehicles and the vertiports designed to accommodate those vehicles, how do we put that into place? There were a lot of policies that were set in motion to allow aviation to grow like it did, right? There were a lot of different agencies created after the Wright brothers, not before, obviously, that allowed aviation to be a commonplace mode of transportation. So let's talk about what it takes to make this commonplace. What does this new system of transportation system entail? And what does it take to get there? So for different areas, we're going to have different rules and regulations. Where do we start? Initially, when everybody got very excited about this, and there were a lot of big name companies that came out with white papers and came out with ideas, it was very much wild, wild west. And while the companies pushed the technologies, the infrastructure people started thinking, well, how do we accommodate those new vehicles? And what are the rules? What are the regulations? What are the thresholds? How do we know really how to operate this in a full urban environment, in an ecosystem? How do we scale this up? So at ATS, we started with a very simple concept. What do people already accept? And I know that I say that's simple, but really marrying the aviation industry at 36,000 feet with the surface transportation industry at 0 feet was not an idea that quickly came to mind for a lot of folks. But we asked, like, what is already acceptable? And the clear answer is the roads. Now, more than just the roads, there's also the right-of-ways. So if you take that from a Department of Transportation's perspective, there are several different types of transportation corridor right-of-ways. You've got the roads, you've got rail, you've got power lines. There are lots of different infrastructure right-of-ways. But before we get too complex, let's talk about the roads for a little bit. So at ATS, we thought, well, yes, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but what does that straight line go over? And we knew immediately that there are some places in the world that they don't want you flying over their house or their park or their school or their hospital. So a straight line wouldn't work. We also looked at, well, what are the safest places that you could fly over that's close to a straight line, using GIS data? Well, and then we decided that's not future scalable. So a solution really had to be future scalable, meaning that, well, if I design a corridor over a empty patch of land, that may not stay an empty patch of land. The future development of that land may include homes, may include businesses, may include a school. I have to take that into consideration. So we thought, well, the current road system is already accepted by the public as a transportation corridor and is fairly permanent. It's static. A road can widen, a road can shift, but you're not going to have major land developments on that road. You're not going to have major changes in that roadway. It's not a straight line, but the right of ways on the roadways can be adjusted to make a straight line. It's also very publicly acceptable, and that's the reason we started out with the roads, right? People already accept transportation corridors there. So all we had to do was take the roadmap and raise it up to a given altitude. Now, the other issue we came across while working with this was, what's that altitude? So if you're going to take the roadmap and elevate it, what's the altitude? Well, again, there are politically acceptable answers, and then there are technically desired answers, right? In some cultures and places, they don't want to be very high. For them, it feels safer to be closer to the ground. While in some places, the vehicles kind of mandate, we want higher altitude. We want to be higher in the ground. Do your customers want to be at that altitude? The vehicle can do it, but do your customers want it? And if your customers do want it, okay, your vehicle can do it, but where do you start hitting the current manned aircraft airspace? So I kind of talked about three things in one there. Let's break those down. So we decided that air corridor design needed to be uniquely adaptable. If I want to put it at 200 feet, I can do that. If I want to put it at 400 feet, I can do that. And you need to be able to adjust it and adjust the approach and departure procedures for that corridor, and we'll get to that later. Adjust the corridor and the approach and departure procedures to meet demand, as the demand required. So that was the first thing. This had to be adjustable to meet the public demand. It also had to follow the ground, right? AGL, above ground level. So it has to have terrain following and map that. Best way to do that is with GIS data. That also gives you a third dimension of terrain height. So we incorporated that. The next thing was, okay, well, let's look at this second kind of piece of it, the second aspect of, well, once we have adjustable altitude, how do we and how should we adjust lane widths and assignments and speed? Now, when we got to this point, there are several different vehicles that we could accommodate to. Some are faster, some are slower, some are larger, some are smaller. So we had to really think, how do we make an agnostic system that accommodates all of those vehicles, but also establishes a set of rules and regulations? Now, it's important that I just said the words rules and regulations, because here's really where, up until this point, we've been doing the math, doing the calculations, taking into account the politics, so the personal preferences, and now we hit, how do we match those together to make a rule or a regulation within which our ecosystem is going to be bound? It's really going to start to establish our constraints. So we look at speed limits, right? So if we have one vehicle or two vehicles in the air, it's a big sky. We could use big sky theory and just say go as fast as you can. What happens if we have 2,000 vehicles in the air? What happens if we have 2,001 vehicles in the air? How many vehicles can you accommodate at a given speed, at a given lane width, lane height, and do it safely without any traffic jams, without any incidences? And it also, as we started to answer those questions, it teaches us where are your thresholds, where are your pinch points, where you start to see traffic jams, where you start to see those problem areas of if we run a simulation, where does a vehicle have to hold or hover for another vehicle to move out of the way? And it taught us several things. A couple of those lessons we'll get to later, or they'll be out of the scope of this particular session. You're more than welcome to contact us to talk about those. However, speed, setting a speed limit was the first kind of question we looked at for different types of vehicles. So within an ecosystem, you set this range. And so we established like what happens if we say the aircraft, they may be capable of more, but what if we limit them to 40 knots or 60 knots or 80 knots? What's the ramifications of that rule, of making that a rule? And so we looked at that. We also looked at the ramifications of making rules and setting parameters for heights of lanes to provide for vehicle separation vertically, and width of lanes to provide for vehicle separation horizontally. Again, the vehicles may be of different size. Some of them, again, are larger and so have a greater width. And how do you accommodate that versus a smaller vehicle? And what's your separation distance threshold? So I won't go into the details of that too much because it is just a lot of math and I don't want to bore you with the math on that. Needless to say, we took in we really averaged two kind of vehicles, and that was package delivery drones and then aerial taxis. So then we got to looking at, well, how do you put package delivery drones, if you've established a speed limit that gives you a proper optimization of the airspace, given a set width and height of lanes, how do you then organize these lanes and these vehicles by vehicle type, right? So you can do this a couple of ways, and ATS processes and software allow governments and companies to say, well, let's adjust. Let's put package delivery at 100 feet and aerial taxis at 800 feet. Or let's put aerial taxis at 200 feet and package delivery at 600 feet. Or whatever mixture or combination you can think of, which allows both a company or a government, a DOT, to really adjust to meet the needs of its people. And that really is the important part. The government agencies want to adjust to meet the needs of their people. Companies want to adjust to meet the needs of their customers. So that's what ATS and the software really allow you to do. So as we work with Varen vehicles, and we talked about this South America concept of what urban air mobility might look like, we understood that is a completely different concept than what a North American urban air mobility framework might look like. And we kind of already knew that within the states within the United States. Is one state is very different. Nevada is very different from New York. South Carolina is very different from Texas. But those differences really are logistical, geographical, and urbanization. But there are cultural differences in South America. And so we started to really realize this corridor design has to be very, very adjustable to meet a very, very specific set of customer needs. So we went on from there, and said, okay, let's look at um, customer comfort, and let's start looking at the policies for that. So uh, for customer comfort, really that falls into vehicle design. Um, but so I kind of want to step aside from that. I'm not a vehicle manufacturer. I don't want to speak for them. But everybody who sees this, not just the people who ride in it, but everybody who sees it and everybody who is impacted by it is a customer. So the people on the ground, the people in the nearby buildings who are working, the people who, and if you really think big picture, and I mean really big picture policy wise, if you're moving people from one location to another, let's say they are now able to get a better job, they're now able to live further out and maintain their current job but have a better lifestyle. Whatever that reason is, you're going to open up opportunities within your economy for people to start changing. And I want to hit on this later. I want to hit on this concept of change later. But as you open those up, not everybody, that's the reason I say not everybody that sits in the vehicle is the customer. Everybody who's impacted by the vehicle is the customer. So, and this really hits on why I like the geodesics, is we're thinking about the people who are impacted by these that may not be sitting in the vehicle. We're thinking about where these are going, how much noise they're causing, what's the visual impact that they're creating over a neighborhood. Even if it's not directly over the neighborhood, over the roadway, you can still see them, you can still hear them. What are those impacts to everybody on the ground, right? And so you start looking into policies based on impacts of these non-direct customers, and how does that change the way you design your airspace? Interesting. That is an interesting, very long-term discussion and thought process that is a very public process. So I want to talk about a little bit about change, and since we've hit on really the big picture, economic change and mobility change, what does this mean for us as a society as we go through this change? So at ATS, we believe, as most of us are pilots. So the ATS company, most of us are pilots, and we have learned to think in 3 dimensions. And we believe that as people learn to move in 3 dimensions, that will change the way they think. And if it changes the way they think and it changes the way they see the world around them, it will change the way they live. It will open up opportunities to them. They may see an opportunity that they didn't feel was there before. And so it really is going to change not only the way they move, but the way they live and the way they interact with government agencies, businesses, neighboring communities. It's going to change competition. It's going to change collaboration. All of these kind of peripheral factors are going to be affected as people change the way they think and they learn to think in 3 dimensions. So taking that into account, we want to anticipate what that might be. One of those anticipations is power, right? And this is both direct and indirect. Utility, let's just say utility. So if you have a vertiport in a downtown area versus a vertiport in a rural area or a vertiport in a suburban area, how does that change the utility of each of those areas? Not just how do you get the power to the aircraft, and that is a problem. So we'll have to address that problem. How do we get the power to the aircraft? But also, how do we plan for this different use of the land? So land use planning, right? If you're no longer constrained by surface transportation, you really do want to start look at how can we utilize this land a little bit differently? If say you have a community who was constrained to Well, I can only get to a job within 20 to 30 minutes of where I live, and that limits me. But now I can get to a job an hour away from from where I lived, but it only takes me 15 minutes to get there. Okay, now what does that community start to look like? And in thinking of that, how do we plan for that land use? How do we plan for architecture and what kind of buildings people live in? If they're multifamily housing and you want to put a vertiport on the roof, or if it's a shopping mall and you want to put a vertiport on the roof or in the parking lot. And so we really have to start to change the way we visualize the city, because it's right now, most of our cities, whether you're in South America or North America or Europe, the city structure and land use planning has been laid out to accommodate the major form of transportation. Now, while I'm not saying that urban air mobility is going to be the major form of transportation anytime soon, but we do have to take into foresight how this will become a major form of transportation and what that allows for us to change on the ground. So, whether you are a 1,200-year-old village in Europe and your transportation system is designed around horses and carriages, or you're a 300-year-old city in New England, United States, in the New England area, and your transportation system is designed around the Henry Ford automobile, or you're a South American city which is far more dense and your transportation system is designed around trains, cars, walking, bike, whatever that is. Okay, how do you now accommodate how do you now accommodate people's new way of living with this new transportation system? What kind of architecture change do you have to use for people living in buildings that now have to have a landing pad on the roof? What kind of architecture change or land use planning change do you now have to have if your community can thrive 60 miles away from the urban economic center, and yet you're transitioning this economic impact to different parts of the region? So, and what are the policies that come into place with that? So those are the type of things that we're thinking about at ATS. Is number one, obviously the corridors. You have to think about the corridors. They have to be adjustable for the different demands of customers and the different, whether you're a company or a transportation agency, a government agency. They have to be adjustable for culture. And then second, second to that, not second to that, I don't want to say that. I want to say it's secondary. It's secondary. The second step is then measuring the impact on people's lives, and how is this going to change the way they interact with those companies, those government agencies, and the urban economic centers, and the economic impact that this is going to alter and move around the region. And planning has to come with that. It has to come with that, not just airspace planning, land use planning, utility planning. All of that is incorporated. That, by definition, is a true ecosystem. So that's what we're doing at ATS. And again, I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you all for listening to me give my little spiel on this. Visit our website, aerialtransportationsolutions.com. Visit the Varon Vehicles website. I'm sure, Varon, thank you, Philippe, for heading this up, for being the tip of the spear in South America on this. This will change. This will not only change the way we move, but I truly believe this will change the human experience as we interact with each other and the environment around us. So thank you very much.